Brooke Goldstein is a New York City-based human rights attorney and award-winning filmmaker. She serves as director of the Lawfare Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to raising awareness about and facilitating a response to the abuse of Western legal systems and human rights law. Brooke is also the founder and director of the Children's Rights Institute, which is a not-for-profit organization whose mission is to track, spotlight, as well as legally combat violations of children's basic human rights as occurring throughout the globe. Brooke's award-winning documentary film, The Making of a Martyr, uncovers the illegal, state-sponsored indoctrination and recruitment of Palestinian children for suicide-homicide attacks. Filming Martyr, Brooke secured first-hand interviews with active and armed members of the Al-Aqsa, Fatah, Islamic Jihad, and Hamas terrorist groups, as well as with families of suicide bombers, children imprisoned for attempting to blow themselves up, teachers at terrorist-run schools, and others involved in the phenomenon of child suicide bombing. Brooke is a regular commentator on Fox News and has been featured in media including CNN, The New York Sun, and many others. And she has been published in a variety of sources, including the New York Daily News and others. Brooke's first book, co-authored with Aaron A. Tonmeyer and entitled Lawfare Against Free Speech, a First Amendment Guide for Reporting in an Age of Islamic Lawfare, is due out in the summer of 2011, so hopefully it did come out already. Brooke will discuss lawfare and the use of law as a weapon of war to delegitimize Israel and the shared implications for democracies. My pleasure to welcome Brooke.
I want to thank the American Zionist Movement and the World Zionist Organization for inviting me and the organizers of this conference. It's really quite an honor to serve on a panel with Dan and Ken, two luminaries that I admire and respect very much. So hopefully I'll be as compelling as them. In my opinion, there are two fronts to the war between the Israelis and the Arabs. There's two fronts in general in the war between democracies and totalitarian dictatorships. And the greatest nonviolent threat to not just Israel, but to all democracies is lawfare, the use of the law as a weapon of war to, amongst other things, delegitimize the rights of democracies to defend themselves, to defend their citizens against terrorism, and to exert sovereign control over their own territory. And this is especially true for both the United States and Israel, for which every act of delegitimization lawfare, I would argue, has shared implications. I learned this in a conversation that I had with a colleague of mine from the United States military about the Goldstein report. And when the report first came out, everybody was talking about the legal and the political implications this report would have for Israel. And I complained to my colleague over the telephone about how international law was being deliberately manipulated and misapplied to delegitimize Israel's right to exist as a sovereign state for the Jewish people with equal rights in the world community. And as I went on and I continued, my colleague interrupted me and he said, "Brooke, you know, you've kind of got it all wrong. The Goldstein report isn't just about Israel. It's about setting precedents in the international legal system that can and will be used against the United States, that can and will be used against coalition forces fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, fighting using the same methods that the Israelis are using in the battlefield against the same types of terrorists who are engaging in asymmetric warfare, who are using human shields, who are using child suicide bombers, for example." And the more that I thought about it, the more I tended to agree with him, because Israel is being used now on the legal front, just as it has always been used on the physical battlefield as the canary in the coal miner's tunnel, as a legal testing ground for actions that are aimed at frustrating and hindering the ability of a democratic state to fight and win the war against terrorism. And the greatest mistake that we can make as a community and as human beings with a deep interest in upholding the principles of human rights law is to analyze lawfare actions like the Goldstein report, like the ICJ fence decision, like the flotillas, like the BDS movement, like Durban, like UDI, in an Israel-centric vacuum. And the number one impediment, in my opinion, the number one critical hurdle that we faced in convincing the world community not to accept lawfare actions aimed at Israel is the mistaken belief that these standards will only be used against Israel. They won't, and we can see from examples that they are not. If immunity can be stripped from and trumped up war crimes charges can be brought against Israeli government officials in Spain, in Belgium, in Switzerland, in New Zealand, in Denmark, in the Netherlands, and in Canada, what's stopping the same groups from using the same universal jurisdiction laws and affecting the same types of politicized prosecutions against elected officials from the United States, Britain, and France? Well, nothing. In fact, Belgium did attempt to prosecute both former President Bush and former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair for their participation in the war in Iraq. The prosecution only dropped the case after the United States threatened to pull NATO headquarters out of Belgium. And a Spanish judge likewise attempted to prosecute 6 former legal officials in the Bush administration for the crime of providing our president with legal advice. And just a couple months ago, former President Bush canceled a trip to Switzerland after groups reportedly submitted a war crimes charge against him over waterboarding. And if the Israeli security fence is illegal under international law, as the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, so decided in an advisory opinion in 2004 that pointedly ignored the fact that the fence contributed to a sharp decline in the loss of human lives, and which also refused to hear the testimony from Israeli victims of terrorism. If this is the precedent that the ICJ wants to set, then what about the fence on the U.S.-Mexican border? What would the ICJ think about that? How about the fence on Saudi Arabia's border? If, according to the United Nations Human Rights Council, boarding a flotilla to search for weapons and other materials that are being smuggled to designated terrorist group Hamas is, quote, an outrageous and grave attack, which, quote, requires an international independent fact-finding mission to investigate violations of international human rights law, what then is the United States military's drone program? Would a UN commission or a UN court or a UN fact-finding mission agree with the ACLU that targeted killing of terrorists by drone runs afoul of international law? And do we want to give it the power to do so? If the ICC, the International Criminal Court, succeeds in erroneously declaring jurisdiction over Israel's CAS-led operation in Gaza, despite the fact that Israel has not signed the Rome Treaty, giving it the jurisdiction to do that, and despite the fact that no matter what maneuvering is happening in the United Nations, the Palestinians still aren't a state, what then would prevent the ICC from declaring jurisdiction over the United States, which has also refused to ratify the Rome Treaty out of the very fear that the court is going to be used as a politicized tool against it? So there are shared implications for every act of delegitimization targeting Israel using the legal process, because that is the essence of the law. It sets precedents. And shouldn't Americans be concerned when people are engaging in BDS activities here in the United States? They're doing so in violation of the Export Administration Act. They're doing so in violation of state statutes that prevent unlawful discrimination against citizens based on race, ethnicity, and national origin, and yet nobody, no attorneys general, no attorneys are bringing cases against these people. How about the efforts, the parallel efforts that are aimed to delegitimize the United States and erode our right to hold an enemy combatant for the duration of hostilities? Many of you might recall the Al-Qaeda manuals that instruct captured militants to file false claims of torture, to reposition themselves as victims in the eyes of the law. Well, all 4 cases that were brought against the Navy SEALs who were charged of abusing detainees at Gitmo were dropped because there wasn't an iota of evidence presented against them. But you're not going to hear about that in the New York Times or on CNN. We cannot analyze, nor should we fight, the delegitimization engine of lawfare in an Arab-Israeli-centric vacuum, because if we fail to point out and to draw the parallels, like I just drew for you right now about the shared implications, we risk minimizing the threat and we risk losing potential allies to fight it. So what have been the effects on the assault of Israel's legitimacy in terms of what the mainstream public thinks? Well, why pursue delegitimization in the first place? Because those who are unable to seriously confront, let alone defeat Israel militarily, are realizing their objectives through legal means. Their strategy is basically to undermine public support for the IDF defense measures by making the public believe that those measures are being conducted in an unfair, inhumane way. Because the troops of a democracy, unlike the troops of a dictatorship, they derive their legitimacy and their will to fight from the support of the electorate, which is essential to a democracy's successful military intervention. And so, while IDF soldiers are citizen soldiers in every sense of the word, the number one effect on the mainstream is an attempt to undermine public support for the IDF, to paint Israel as a perpetrator of war crimes, as opposed to a nation engaged in defensive measures to protect its own citizens. This type of delegitimization complements the goal of actually tying the hands of the IDF and constraining the ability of IDF soldiers to fight effectively. And as I understand it, partially as a response to legal attacks on Israel, the IDF now deploys lawyers within each of its divisional commands to advise officers on the front lines as to which targets they can and cannot attack under international law. And now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it not only leads to split-second hesitations, but it also tempers the ability of the IDF to effectively engage in their actions. And wasn't this the case with the Mavi Marmara, where the first wave of troops boarded the vessels wholly underarmed and therefore unprepared for the attack that they faced? That is what lawfare does. The second effect on the mainstream has been confusion. Because when human rights language in terms like apartheid and genocide and terrorism and Nazism are deliberately misapplied, it is done with the goal of diluting their meaning and feeding the inability to distinguish between real instances of human rights violations on the one hand and actions done in the defense of human rights, between terrorists that target civilians and the soldiers that fight to protect them. And when, like in Durban, lies are repeated over and over again, it becomes the truth. When the New York Times publishes the term illegal settlements hundreds of times, it becomes the truth. When Zionism is equated with Nazism, the goal is historical revisionism. And when Israel is labeled an apartheid state, the desired effect is for history to repeat itself, for Israel to follow in the footsteps of the South African apartheid regime after economic, political, military, and social isolation. Apartheid is a term you can pick up, look up in the dictionary, and it's so obviously inapplicable to Israel. But for some reason, too large of a majority of the mainstream public is unable to make that distinction. The goal of lawfare is thus to effect confusion, to make misinformation mainstream, to create a new language, to shift away attention from real human rights violators onto Israel, to put Israel on the defense, to make us waste time parsing line after line of the Goldstein report, to make us waste time and energy and resources responding to UDI when the UN could be producing a report on genocide occurring in Sudan or the persecution of Christian minorities in Muslim countries. The third major effect of delegitimization lawfare against Israel has been to erode respect for due process and to undermine the Western legal system itself. It is an attack on the rule of law itself. When over 100 UN resolutions are issued to condemn Israel, but not even one resolution has been even offered to criminalize the murder of innocent Muslim children as suicide bombers. We're sending the green lights to terrorists. We're telling them they can continue their actions with legal impunity. What kind of credibility do we give a United Nations that elects Saudi Arabia to a 4-year seat on its Commission on the Status of Women? What kind of credibility do we give a UN General Assembly that's manipulated over and over again by a 57-member voting bloc of Islamist states that's currently lobbying to exclude the targeting of both American and Israeli civilians from the definition of the crime on terrorism, and also the same voting bloc that has lobbied the United Nations every year for over a decade to successfully pass resolutions that ban the blasphemy of Islam as a crime against humanity? What kind of impression is given when little to no legal accountability is demanded of Hezbollah and Hamas and their agents remain free to cross European borders, while at the same time C.P. Livni and Dutch politician Geert Wilders are threatened with arrest if they land in England, an ally? Does this not evidence bias in the application of the law, if not a complete disregard for the concept of equality before the law? When international law is interpreted to prove an inadequate guarantor of the basic right to self-defense, the mainstream perception of international law and its organs becomes one of distrust, contempt, and ultimately indifference. And this outcome is not in the interests of any democracy. But legal challenges to Israel's legitimacy also have had some positive effects. It has prompted some to call for changes and updates in the substance of international law. It has prompted the UK just recently to change its domestic laws concerning who can file an arrest warrant for foreign officials. We're now seeing calls for accountability and transparency when it comes to NGOs who have crown themselves the arbiters of human rights law, but they are at the same time receiving foreign funding with political strings attached, and often from groups or from states who engage themselves in massive human rights violations. Finally, what can be done from your end? Well, first and foremost, you can visit the website of the Lawfare Project, www.thelawfareproject.org. You can sign yourself up for our mailing list. You can keep yourself informed and help us to raise awareness about this phenomenon and to frame the issue appropriately. Second, we have to work together to delegitimize the delegitimizers. We have to call into question the authority granted those who claim to be the protectorates of the Palestinian people. We have to call out their hypocrisy for turning a blind eye to Hamas and to the PA, the two entities who are the real sources of human rights violations against the Palestinian people. And lastly, attorneys must work together to restore the legitimacy of international law and its court system. We have to go on the offense. We have to bring cases against the real perpetrators of human rights abuses in these forums. We have to set the precedents that are needed to overturn the bad law that has been created by lawfare to date. And to this end, we recently announced a group called ANGEL, Attorneys and Academics for International and National Justice Under Law. And we operate as a coalition of attorneys who are ready and willing to stand guard, to fight lawfare, to work pro bono, to work at reduced rates. And I hope that every attorney in this audience takes it upon him or herself to join us in this fight. Thank you.